Your live interactive Weather Authority coverage will begin shortly. Your live Weather Authority coverage starts right now.
Well, good morning, everybody, and happy Tuesday. Hopefully you're staying dry out there on this fairly damp start to the day. It's been a pretty damp week so far, but overall pretty quiet across the state. We've been very lucky, missing out on some major flooding down to our south, and we are looking ahead to improving weather later on this week. But of course, that's not why we're here. We're talking about Hurricane Lee, and it's going to be bringing us some impacts here as we head into this weekend. So I'll get into that in just a second as I let more people join. Let's talk about what we're seeing out there right now. You may have seen some heavier downpours early this morning, few sprinkles, light showers out there right now as well. But overall, it's pretty quiet as we start off the day today. Just going to be a fairly damp one out there as we head into this afternoon. For today, right around 70 for most of us. Not too bad out there this afternoon. Let's talk about later this week, though. A lot of people have been asking me, when do we get rid of this humidity, Christian? Well, that's coming late this week. Thursday and Friday looking much drier. It's going to be really, really nice out there late this week, really nice and sunny as well. So looking much better if you are looking ahead to some drier weather. If you're looking forward to it or you want it, it's coming here late this week. We get 2 great days before Lee arrives this weekend to prepare. Get ready for the storm. By Thursday and Friday, we'll have a really, really good idea of what we're going to see with Lee this weekend. But of course, let's get into it. Tracking Hurricane Lee, a massive hurricane just to the north of Puerto Rico right now. And you can see it is a big, big storm, over 500 miles across with its cloud shield right now. It's going to continue to get bigger and bigger. So that's why we are going to see impacts. Even if it passes far offshore, we will still get some impacts here in Maine because it's just going to be so dang big. It's going to be a very big storm here by the time it reaches us in New England. So let's take a look at the current statistics on Lee, or what we know and what we don't know when it comes to Lee. So the timing, we know that for sure. It's Saturday into Sunday, really Saturday evening, Saturday night. That's when the worst of Lee is going to be. We also know for a fact there's going to be some coastal issues. There's going to be big waves, very big waves. In fact, there's going to be definitely some overwash at high tides and potentially some coastal flooding and erosion as well. That's a guarantee. There's going to be some coastal impacts. Definitely a good idea. If you've got a boat out in the ocean, even on a lake, might be a good idea to start bringing it in over the next few days. You've got until Saturday. You could even do it on Saturday morning before the storm arrives, but I would recommend doing it sooner rather than later, so you're not stressing, you're not rushing to get your stuff battened down. Wind gusts and rain amounts. So those are the two probably most important factors for most of us. And of course, those are the two things we have the least certainty about. We're likely to see some of both, some strong winds and some rain in parts of the state, but where that's exactly going to set up and how widespread it will be, as well as how strong it will be, that still needs to be ironed out here as we head later on into this week. Kelly says, these hurricane updates are killing me. My husband's name is Lee. What's Lee going to do this weekend? There's 200% chance of a nap. Yeah, gotta have some humor here, a little levity in a hurricane tracking situation. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint when you're tracking out a hurricane. You can be tracking the same storm for 2 weeks, and that's exactly what we're seeing with Lee here. So we've been watching it all last week, this week as well, and of course, finally impacting us by the time we get into this weekend. So let's take a look at our current thinking with Lee. It's likely to be to the east. And in fact, I just looked at some of the updated model data that just came out a few minutes ago, and it further confirms that we're thinking it's going to go to the east. In fact, this morning, the shift to the east is pretty apparent. A bend to the west, though, which is possible, could bring us some bigger impacts. Some models show a jog back into the Gulf of Maine closer to us. That would bring us some bigger impacts. We also, again, know the timing really well. It's Saturday into Sunday. I would say prepare for a strong fall nor'easter. That's basically what it will be by the time it reaches us. It will no longer be a hurricane. It won't even be a tropical storm anymore by the time it gets here. Most likely impacts, big waves, coastal issues, some rain and wind. Again, the rain and wind part, that's the part we know the least about as of right now. Better idea to stay in than go out near the coast. You know, if you can do it carefully, I think it'd be really cool to see what's going to be happening along the coast this weekend. If you can go somewhere where you know you'll be safe, far away from the ocean, seeing the waves crashing against the rocks, that might be really cool. I would not recommend going in the ocean though at all this weekend. Of course, the current's going to be very strong. If there's damage being done, you don't want to be in that water. But if you live near the ocean, might be cool to go check out the waves smashing into the rocks, especially if Lee passes far to the east. Then it won't be a concern for the rain and wind. We'll just be dealing with the waves. Then, yeah, definitely will be pretty cool to go down towards the coastline to see some big waves. Jesse asking a good question here. Any hurricanes behind Lee to watch out for? Not at the moment, but of course, we're in the peak of hurricane season, so we'll have to keep a close eye. Hopefully, Lee is not like the trial run for a worse storm. Hopefully, this is our only hurricane threat of the entire season. Will Yarmouth be affected at all? Surely in some way. It may not be a major impact, but it will likely be affected at least a little bit in Yarmouth, and especially the coastline, although Yarmouth pretty protected up into Casco Bay. So maybe the impacts there not quite so big. So let's take a look at the current statistics for Lee. It is a Category 3 storm, a major hurricane, still very big, as I just showed you earlier, 500 miles across, and it's only going to get bigger in size as we head through the next several days. So let's take a look at this track. This just in its own is pretty interesting. Even if we get nothing from Lee, this is pretty interesting. Not too often that we have Maine, really the only state forecast to be most impacted by a hurricane. So screenshot this. This does not happen too often. Maine solidly in a forecast cone for a hurricane. But I want to point out a couple things here. Notice, first of all, the L that's over Nova Scotia there, Lee, not going to be a hurricane. It's not going to be a tropical storm anymore by the time it gets up here. The cold, cold waters of the Gulf of Maine, they're going to weaken it and transition it into a nor'easter. An extra tropical storm is what we call that. Cold air gets into the center. It's no longer a hurricane when that happens. So it will still be powerful. It will still be big, but it will not be tropical, will not be a hurricane anymore. And it won't be all that strong either by the time it gets up here, but it will be affecting a large area. And that's why there's a fairly big concern with Lee. So we're going to continue to track this. It will continue to get tighter and tighter as we head towards Sunday. So while most of Maine is in this cone right now, that will likely not be the case here over the next couple of days. It's going to continue to narrow down even more and more. All right, let's get into the nitty gritty here, the meat of this forecast. Let's take a look at some models here, what we're thinking. The trends, I've got to say, been pretty favorable this morning. In fact, this cluster of models, the spaghetti plot, as we like to call it in the weather world, has shifted just a little bit more towards Nova Scotia. When I was here earlier this morning, a few more of those lines were crossing the Maine coast. Now less of them are. So that's a good trend for us here. Notice some of them do have a little bit of a west bend. Looks like that's becoming more unlikely now at this point. So that would be great news for us. We'll keep our fingers crossed for that, because that one, that we don't want that bend west. Obviously, that would bring us some more impacts. We like the trend that I've seen this morning. At least we could see it trend back the other way, but we're getting closer and closer now. Those big shifts left and right, they're going to happen less and less now as we head through the next couple of days. So you can see this is just one plot of a bunch of different models here. Let's look at a different one. This is the one that brings it closest to Maine. We've got a couple different possibilities here. This is the European model. And if you know anything about weather forecasting, it's totally fine if you don't, but if you do, the Euro tends to be regarded as one of the most accurate models for weather forecasting in the world here. Now, the Euro this morning is very close to Maine. I've got to say, it's by far the closest to Maine. All these spaghetti plots, a lot of them do come right up the Maine coast, and you can also see that westward bend. If you notice that, you can see that bend back towards the Maine coast. Gotta say, though, this is an outlier. Most models are not this close to Maine. And even still, the Euro, a lot of the members, the center of it still goes into Nova Scotia. So I would say most likely Nova Scotia. It would be a really very much an outlier if it did hit Maine. So I'm thinking probably late today or even tomorrow, we'll be able to lock in that Maine will not be directly hit by this storm. But again, it's not really going to change our impacts all that much. All right, I'm going to see what you guys are saying. I want to get your thoughts here. Good morning. Happy Tuesday to you, Brandon. Thanks, D. I really appreciate that comment. No concerns for Margot behind Lee. Great question, Andrew. No, Margot is going to stay far out to sea. In fact, Lee is going to keep Margot away. Margot is going to be blocked. It won't be able to come back towards us here because Lee is going to be in the way. And then once Lee moves to the east, it will also push Margot out to the east. So no concerns with Margot. But potentially maybe next week we may have to watch another storm that might form down in the Caribbean, but that's very early. Of course, our focus here is on Lee. Jesse asking a question about the wave heights. Depends on the track, but 10 to 20 feet, that's going to be pretty likely in the Gulf of Maine. So yeah, these are going to be some big waves, potentially the biggest we see all year long here. So yeah, it'll be a pretty cool sight to be at the ocean. I would just say stay far away from the water and don't be in a place where the waves can come up and get you. In these type of situations, you can have, some big waves, and then you'll get one massive wave that comes in and can catch people off guard. So again, if you're going to go see the waves this weekend, just be very, very cautious. I'm ready for the power outages. Brandon, I'm really hoping that we get through this event with minimal power outages, at least in central and southern Maine. Down east Maine might be a different story, but I think that a lot of us won't see a ton of power outages. It just looks like the wind will be right at the coastline, the strongest wind, and it won't be further inland. I'm sure there could be some, but and again, if that track shifts closer to Maine, then we will likely see a lot more. But as of right now, my thinking is that we're not going to see a ton of widespread power outages, which hopefully would be some good news for us. And Brandon asking, other Brandon asking the same question here about power outages. As of right now, I'm not thinking there will be widespread power outages, but good idea to get things prepared. Maybe get some batteries in those flashlights, get your flashlights all ready, charge up those portable power banks later in the week, get some food items. So maybe if you are stuck at home for a couple of days, you're prepared just in case. It's always good to be prepared for these sort of situations. And if nothing happens, hey, you were prepared. Trial run, you can think of it that way, for a worse storm that could come in the future. Even without direct landfall, risk of outages. Great point, Valerie. That's exactly right. Even without landfall, there will be a risk of outages. In fact, most scenarios say no landfall, but the outage risk is still going to be there. I would say, again, not a major. If I had to put it on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd say Lee right now a 4.5, just under a 5, I would say, in terms of the scale here. Maybe tomorrow it could go up to a 6. Could go down to a 4, and on a scale of 1 to 10, widespread power outages being 10, nothing happening being 1. So somewhere in the middle, it will likely end up. How about Rockland? Now, Rockland, a little bit more interesting, Dan, because you are further down the coastline. I'd say your impacts will probably be more than a lot of us here in Maine. You'll likely get some of the stronger winds, more likely to see some rain there over in Rockland in the mid-coast, and of course the waves along the coastline in Rockland, and that coastal surge or coastal flooding, that threat is even higher over in Rockland. Bridgeton, Kimberly's asking about Bridgeton. Brandy similarly asking about the Oxford Hills. I'm feeling pretty positive about inland areas, especially up towards the mountains. There will certainly be some gusty winds. There will certainly be some rain. But what I'm thinking is for inland areas, probably just turns into a raw, cool, rainy day, maybe an isolated power outage or two, but nothing too crazy. I'm thinking as of right now for Bridgeton and Oxford Hills. Of course, stay tuned, though. That could easily change. If this thing comes right into Maine, that would be a different story. But as of right now, again, we're not expecting it to come right into Maine. And I want to put up this banner first. It's very too early for location-specific impacts. I can tell you, you might get some wind. I can't tell you how strong it'll be. I can tell you might get some rain. I can't tell you how much rain you're going to get. So if you just saw that European model, this is the American model. Notice a big shift to the east. It is way over in Nova Scotia. In fact, only 2 of the models really are bringing it into Maine. So most models keeping it to the east. I want to do this comparison once again in the Euro model from what I just ran earlier. Notice how this one is much closer to Maine, and then the GFS model is much further away from Maine. I'll rock back and forth here a couple times between these. Further away, closer. Most likely it goes somewhere in the middle, fairly close to Maine, not close enough for a direct hit. And in the end, it hits Nova Scotia. We see some impacts, but nothing too crazy. That's likely what's going to happen as of right now. Now, if things suddenly all shift close to Maine later today, well, that would be a different story. But if things shift even further offshore, may not really be anything for us other than some big waves at the coastline. So again, still have to work through those inconsistencies. Notice big spread in these models as they come up into New England and into Nova Scotia. A lot of people asking about Cape Cod. Eleanor, I have a vacation this weekend on Cape Cod. I am wondering the same thing here. The trends have been positive for Cape Cod, but again, big waves, strong winds out there. I'd say Cape Cod probably, as of right now, has the highest risk of seeing power outages from this storm. Probably some of the messiest impacts will be down in Cape Cod, Eleanor. Great question about that. How about 20 miles inland Brooks area? I'm thinking you'll probably be pretty okay, Laurel. There may be some branches down, that sort of thing. Way too early to give you that kind of specific detail, but as of right now, my thinking is that inland areas won't be hit too hardly by this. This is going to be more of a coastal event, although inland areas could certainly see impact, though. So again, stay tuned to the forecast heading through the rest of the week. Brandon says, let's hope it misses us. Yeah, I'm on team. Get out of here. Miss us. I do not. I do not want a direct hit on Maine. We don't need those kind of impacts. And again, I got a vacation this weekend. I really would love to go on. So hopefully it stays far away. Coriolis added to the upper level trough should steer it away. Interesting point there, buddy, because if the trough was stronger, we wouldn't be talking about a threat to Maine. The trough would just sweep Lee right out to sea. But the trough is fairly weak. The low pressure dip in the jet stream that's going to take Lee to the east. It's fairly weak, and that's why Lee will be able to get so close to Maine. It's not too often you get a storm tracking into the Bay of Fundy. That's really not that common at all. So it takes a weak trough for that sort of thing to happen. There's really not a lot of oomph to pick Lee up and sweep it out to sea, for lack of a better word there. So yeah, somewhat interesting that this trough is pretty weak. A little gap here between high pressure over Bermuda to the east and low pressure off to our west. That's where Lee is going. And those are the steering factors that are going to have the big impact on its forecast. Yeah, other Brandon says, oh, nope, same Brandon. Sorry, Brandon Filer. Let's hope it just misses us. Yep, same here. I'm hoping for that as well. So again, models in different camps right now. Some of them bring it right into Nova Scotia. Some of them bring it close to Maine and then bring it into Nova Scotia. Some of them bring it right into Maine. I'd say by far Nova Scotia landfall. That is most likely what's going to happen. I'm fairly confident we'll be able to lock that down, hopefully by tomorrow. And then we will see it moving off towards the east. So Nova Scotia, most likely, we will see some impacts here in Maine. Probably not a major devastating storm. I would say it would be less impactful than the Christmas Eve storm that we saw last year. If you remember that was a pretty nasty storm. Don't think it will be as bad as that. Again, this is pretty comparable to a nor'easter here, what we're looking at. So let's take a look at our weekend forecast. Of course, the weekend most impacted Saturday afternoon and evening, windy, potentially some rain as well, big coastal issues. But by Sunday, we're improving. Sunday afternoon, after Lee moves out, mid-70s, sunshine returning, looking pretty good. So it's a quick mover. We'll only be putting up with it for a few hours Saturday evening, and it's pretty much gone by the time we get into Sunday. So some good news there. At least it will be a quick mover as well. Euro model. Okay, buddy. So I was looking at it last night. The Euro model had been very consistently going into Nova Scotia. It was well off to the east. This morning, it had a noticeable shift back to the west, closer to Maine, buddy. And I'm very interested to see what the afternoon model shows. If it sticks to its guns and it says, pretty close to Maine, I would think maybe more of an impact here. But if it shifts back to the east, which is also very possible, if not likely, then I would think, okay, maybe it is likely to go to the east here. But the Euro, I don't like to discount it because it is usually a very accurate model. So again, something to watch out for. But yeah, the Euro model is a little bit closer to Maine. It has a bend to the west, and then it goes to the east. So I'm actually going to pull that up again because I do want to show that plot. It is fairly close to Maine with its impacts, but again, that is an outlier here. This is what a lot of the models are thinking into Nova Scotia for the most part. The Euro, which I'm about to play here, and this is the Euro. Again, a lot of them a lot closer to Maine, but still the majority going into Nova Scotia. So there was a shift west, but not a major shift to the west. And I think that we might see it actually shift back to the east. That's called the windshield wiper effect. The models will kind of windshield wiper until they get a good lock on what they think the storm will be doing. All right, let's talk about some other models here. Here's another look. See, most are going into Nova Scotia. Only a couple bring it here into Maine. So that's why I'm thinking almost all the model consensus now says Nova Scotia is going to be what's hit. The outliers do point to Maine, some of those, and an outlier, of course, can never be ruled out, but I'd say it's pretty likely Nova Scotia will be the most impacted with this storm. Our hurricane forecasts have gotten really good over the past few years. So with the track, I'd say Nova Scotia looking really likely to be the point of landfall. So I want to bring up those headlines again before I wrap this up. Of course, we'll be doing Facebook Lives. We'll be tracking it through the rest of the week and into the weekend as well. Again, track likely to the east. A bend to the west could bring bigger impacts. As of right now, I'd say if I had to put a percentage on it, I don't like to do this, but just for the sake of you guys, I will put a percentage on it. I'd say 80% chance it's going to go to the east into Nova Scotia and leave us with impacts, but not crazy impacts. So the timing, again, Saturday into Sunday, it's going to be like a nor'easter, nothing we haven't seen before. I don't think it'll feel like a tropical hurricane, palm trees swaying in the wind, snapping off, that sort of thing. It will not be like that. It'll be like a nor'easter, a wind-driven, chilly rain. You might be like, wow, this is a hurricane. It's chilly outside. It'll be in the 50s, it looks like, for a lot of the storm on Saturday. Most likely impacts are coastal. If you got a boat, again, I've been saying this all morning, probably a good idea to maybe start thinking about bringing it into at least a safe harbor, if not out of the water altogether. Rain and wind is what we've got to lock down. I'm hoping by tomorrow I'll be able to give you guys some details on what we're expecting in terms of rain and in terms of wind. But if we can't, then of course stay tuned and we'll get those details later on this week. So stay tuned to this forecast. It can and it probably will change in some ways. And of course, we'll get more specific details in the next couple days as well. And of course, we will keep you updated here on Channel 13. So have a great day, everybody. Stay safe out there. Stay nice and cozy and dry out there on this damp day. Got some great weather to enjoy later this week before Lee gets here. So at least we've got that to look forward to. So have a great one, everybody. And yeah, stay safe out there.